So the topic for this talk here is the many phases of enslavement and subjugation of peoples, nations. Dr. John Murillo III is the professor and chair of African American Studies at the University of California in Irvine. His primary research interests include 20th century and contemporary black literature, speculative fiction, Afro-pessimism, critical theory, and theoretical physics. He is the author of Impossible Stories on the space and time of black destructive creation. He is at work on two projects that are built on the first, the one entitled Infinity, Black on Both Sides, and the other on a mythological memoir titled Orbitals. I don't know about you, but if you know Dr. John, you know he is very detailed in his trying to get us to understand what this is about. And I love it because he not only gives you the background, but he tries to take you from the background to the present day. And I look forward to hearing him talk. Without further ado, Dr. John Murillo III.
All right, can you guys hear me pretty clearly? I hope. A little louder? Okay. Okay, I'll just speak louder. Is it on? Yeah. I think that'll make it easier for everybody. So I recognize some faces, so this will be somewhat familiar to you from last time. But previously, I had delivered a lecture that I entitled Jesus and the Insurgency of Care during Black History Month. And I'm going to be sort of continuing that. I will be doing the first half of that presentation, but then we'll take a detour in order to think more specifically and particularly about today's theme, the name of this particular workshop, which is the many faces of slavery. In that vein, the new-ish version of this talk takes its name from a psychological condition. It's called prosopagnosia, the infinite faces of slavery. And so I don't know how many people know what prosopagnosia is, if you've heard of it or not heard of that, but it's a psychological condition or neurological condition where because of various issues in areas of the brain, you can't recognize faces. You can't distinguish another face from another face. So this is obviously relevant to the many faces of slavery idea. And I want to talk about how maybe we can, at least in this room, dispel the problem of that misrecognition. Have a little bit more clarity about the face that's looking at us through and in the world today. So we'll begin similarly to last time, but we'll end up in a different place, a much different place. Okay, so one last thing. I also tell this first part as a narrative. The first part of this is more story-like. I tend to write stories in the form of allegory in order to have the story speak for me. Stories are a little bit more accessible than the stuff that you might find in these books, including mine. Mine does include some stories in order to make the more complicated readings and critical analyses a little bit more digestible and give you an entry point. And so in that vein, that's why I tend to begin with stories and use stories as a way of opening up a space for you to consider the maybe more complex or academic sounding things that I would normally say. So I begin with gratitude. Thank you for welcoming me here today to deliver these remarks. Who is me? My bio says some of what I am and what I've done, but I always have trouble simplifying what it is I find myself doing in classrooms and on pages. But I suppose at my core, I can echo what poet laureate Crystal Wilkinson writes in her most recent book when she says of herself, I am the keeper of the stories. I identify as a storyteller, and I work best by keeping, analyzing, and telling stories. So today I hope you'll indulge me as I tell a long-ish story about Black history in an arrangement of 3 parts. We may not get to the third part because of the detour we're going to take, but if we have time, we'll get there. Let us see what we can make of the arrangements I've tried to make today. So, part 1, we begin by elaborating or doing what we call critical fabulation regarding the moment Jesus weeps as he approaches Jerusalem during the Passover festival, our eyes trained on his as we wonder about the context and content of his tears. So, he descends Mount Olivet slowly, winding through the olive groves. A cool breeze rustles the leaves of the olive trees, transforming the grove into a breathing sea of hushed voices, a surround sound susurrus whispering his name, heralding his approach in the hushed awe of their rejoicing. Palladium oracles, ancient sages, these olive trees bear wise and careful witness as they always have. Each tree lives a testament of all that the Mount of Olives has overseen in the city below, of every lyric the wind sings, and of each time he comes and goes. They grow as history does, flowering with stories formed into green and black jewels, precious fruit prized for the world of knowledge each meager orb holds. Those who tend the trees hold them dear, revere and regard them as family, sibling elders and fellow stewards of this improbable glory, this unimaginable gift called earth of God's merciful making. This is why, when the merciless occupiers of Israel marshal bulldozers, flamethrowers, tanks, and other instruments of terror to destroy these innocent, irreplaceable olive bearers, we, the global tenders to the holy groves, near or far, young or old, Palestinian or not, which is to say, Palestinian geographically or Palestinian in political solidarity, cry out in sorrow, wailing with our whole souls. He knows this as he knows all. He always knows, for he is him. Who is he? The olive leaves susurrate in harmonious prayer. Virtue, love, life, Palestinian Jew, the way, the light, the truth, Savior, prophet, the Lord, Yeshua, Messiah, Jesus. The disciples lay their cloaks to clothe his way along the road to Jerusalem, harmonize. Those who went ahead and who followed shouted, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. The disciples, the denizens of Jerusalem, and the pilgrims arriving for the Passover festival rejoice. The olive trees swoosh, sway, and sing, even the stones cry out. And we who bear distant witness from wherever and whenever we are, behold and glorify him. Together, across time and space, our 6-part harmony composes the symphony of our joy, and we lay our rejoicing before him like cloaks to clothe the road, our jubilation decorating his way. And awash in the outpouring of all our crowing over him, he weeps. Those of us among the chorus who behold him closely, who pay him what Cole Arthur Riley calls, quote, sacred attention, see his tears and wonder at their meaning before he finally speaks and says, if you had known on this day, even you, the conditions for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes, end quote. His eyes are an outpouring of grief as they pass over us and cast his gaze toward Jerusalem, resting on something in the distance, as if at once he is looking at the city and also through it, shooting his sight, his tears, and his words across what would have been all of Palestine, across the Mediterranean Sea, across the Atlantic Ocean, and the oceans of time and space between his where and when and our own. Perhaps his eyes spy the totality of almost a century of still unfolding domicide and genocide carried out by Israel in some bizarro interpretation of what they believe to be holy words. All the technologies born from the worst and least holy parts of our imaginations, funded by money that claims to trust in him. Artillery, munitions, and soldiers birthed by bloody dollars, each embossed with his name, gleefully gifted by a country that claims him as its own. Homes stolen, hospitals and universities demolished, safe zones like this final safe zone, which this needs to be updated, is no longer a safe zone, Rafah, shelled so that there is no shelter there, so that the front line is everywhere, so that the last of Gaza is made a terror dome. Men and women and children, oh, the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of tiny, broken bodies, reduced to ash, crushed amid the rubble, obliterated by every available weapon, or somehow, improbably, impossibly, still alive, crying out for the world to hold them in view, hold them in close as they sing a song many of us know quite well. Jerusalema ikayalami, Jerusalem, my home. Gi lono dose, rescue me. Uhambe nami, join me. Zungangishi yilana, don't leave me here. Before the bombs and the bullets and the unholy words of tyrants and their subjects make the very last of them disappear. And Bethlehem, vaunted Bethlehem, place of his very birth, the site of the origin of what would become this new covenant between God and his creations, wholly decimated with a torrent of bombs and missiles on his own birthday. We know that he is omniscient, so perhaps he simultaneously looks to the north, to Nagorno-Karabakh, the contested, mostly Armenian, and so mostly Christian region of Azerbaijan, where the Soviet Azerbaijani authorities long ago sowed seed for this third reaping, this third stage of the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Armenians from the region, where the ebbs and flows of terror eroded culture, corroded histories, and dissolved whole communities, where more than 120,000 of his future followers have been expelled, fleeing now in the waves of a forced exodus, or perhaps even farther north, to the simultaneously slow-burning and flash-firing catastrophe of the war in Ukraine, where Putin chooses the cruelty of power over the possibility of peace, and the wholesale destruction of people, obliteration of land, and erosion of territory based on an unsubstantiated claim of ownership over the difficult dances of international recognition and political accommodation there, where 315,000, and these numbers need to be updated as well, 315,000 Russian soldiers and at least 130,000 Ukrainian soldiers and civilians have been deemed acceptable collateral for the cowardly proxy battles of powerful men. Perhaps eastward he peers to the sibling expulsion of Afghan refugees. As seer, he sees the 1.7 million given a choice that is no choice at all, to return to totalitarian tyranny under Taliban rule, where women and girls are forbidden from pursuing the education and careers they sought when they fled to Pakistan in the first place, to go back to where hard-fought autonomy for most absolutely disappears, or try to stay and carve out what would be a fugitive existence, always in fear of retaliatory violence, violent deportation, or death, all of which would remain threats forever, everywhere, always near. And surely his all-seeing eyes see south to Sudan, to Khartoum, where personal political conflict has displaced and doomed millions. War loomed, war came, war destroyed, war continues. War now echoes genocide of old, but with heavier booms and deeper bass. 300,000 dead and 3 million lives rocked 2 decades ago resound, amplified into 6 million displaced and 19 million children out of school and thousands more sexually violated and prematurely entombed. The toll rolls, roils, and grows, and every body composes the Sudanese dirge for the largest child displacement crisis in the world. Or maybe further south, perhaps he beholds the catastrophe in Congo, where children and their families are considered acceptable collateral to the world's insatiable demand for diamonds and cobalt. Behold, he thinks, the at least 26 million hungry and the at least 35,000 survivors of gender-based violence. Behold, more than 130 armed groups fighting for control of the land and the mines, control of child miners' lives. Behold, the extremist groups choking life from land and from people. Behold, the slow and agonizing disappearance of the pygmy community. Behold, the whole of the suffering that refracts through the crystal lattice of the diamonds that adorn so many of our rings and ears. The terror in the batteries that let our phones light up and power our laptops and make many of our cars go. And doubtless, His eyes traced the ley lines drawn by European ships filled with Africans transmogrified into cargo. Without a doubt, his eyes spy the sixth science, the disturbing alchemy that transmuted African lives into black objects, atomized and mutated names, tribal and familial ties, and entire internal universes into tally marks, lining the slave ledgers and accounting books, and pulverized connections to stores of cultural, historical, and scientific knowledge. We can surmise that those eyes scry the more than 200 million in bondage, bone-tired and bloodied as they edify entire countries, as they conjure what we now call the United States of America, Brazil, Europe, the entire modern world. His eyes must find us. We stolen world builders find our black hands, black feet, black backs, black hearts, black souls, struggling, fighting, moving, crying out, imagining otherwise, making ways out of no way, stealing time because there never is any, loving, living, and dying in each other's names, and for the sake of a different world, one where our lives more than just matter. He cries, watching the centuries-long outpouring of black folk collide with what feels like an always rising tidal wave of overwhelming terror and domination doled out by the powers that be. Our eyes are watching God, watching him watch what will become our history unfold as his admonition echoes through every tear that he sheds. In all our rejoicing at his arrival, we have yet to know on this day the conditions for peace. And so seeing all that is to come, all the horror that will be done, it is clear that is why he weeps. In sum, we revisit this moment in Jesus' life in order to think really critically about why Jesus weeps. Biblical scholars tend to read Jesus' tears and his ominous admonition about the destruction our limited knowledge will no doubt cause as examples of Jesus' prophetic vision, thinking that he is referring to the soon to come, at the time, destruction of Jerusalem in AD 135 by the Romans. But they often only think that he is referring to this one event. I am asking us to think about Jesus' omniscience, the fact that he is all-seeing, as a way of pushing past the arbitrary limitation of his vision to that one event, and instead wondering aloud and wondering together about all the terror and destruction that he might see when he is looking at and through the city of Jerusalem. I want us to think about the fullest possible scale of what he is seeing and saying to magnify the importance of his message and to better understand its applicability, scope, and its stakes. Part 2. So in this section, Jesus' words reverberate across time and space, and they are haunting. Ghostly, they float over and through our sordid collective history of not knowing, of maybe refusing to learn, the conditions for peace, and alight upon moments where their resonance is maybe most harmonic. We fly through time and space with those words and settle upon just two such moments in the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., whose political and spiritual messages have often been distorted, especially during Black History Month, and at present even by supporters of Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people. So this section is broken into two, and it's because we're going to sort of narratively move with two of his speeches that sort of deal with what I'm talking about. The first speech, or the first section, helps us understand this word conditions. And it's after this particular section that we're going to take our little detour, talk about maybe more about what these conditions might actually be and what's really happening to, on the one hand, maintain them, and then two, maybe think more about their characteristics or maybe their symptoms. If we're going to maybe diagnose the problem as precisely as possible, I think that's something that we have to do before we move any further. So this is the first speech. On April 14th, 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stands at the ornate lectern and shuffles his notes as an overflow crowd of activists, students, faculty, administrators, and clergy and Stanford University's Memorial Auditorium showers him with cacophonous applause. The 7 microphones before him form a picket fence of amplification, and each is another exponential amplifier, recording and casting out his all-important words to a world that most absolutely needs to hear, to really hear them. He calls this speech the Other America. His eloquence in the delivery of his message is his alone, woven together with the careful, drawn-out rises and falls in his voice as he sermonizes about the moral and political failures of the socio-political, existential, cultural project we know as the United States of America. With profound, prophetic clarity, he composes a corrective history for the U.S., one that focuses on the ways inequality has been folded into the very fabric of the country in practice and in principle, with the violent consequences for the most vulnerable among us: women, children, the poor, those living with disabilities, queer and trans folk, people of color, and Black people. He does not know that Saidiya Hartman, esteemed professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University, will describe these violent outcomes as, quote, the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. And the list could definitely go on. He will not live to read her write that this afterlife is the articulation of, quote, a measure of man and a ranking of life, introduced and made real the moment Africans were marked as objects, as property, to be exchanged in a world otherwise populated by humans, and that this set of arrangements would persist in law, in ideology, and in spirit well beyond the era of chains and plantations, and decades beyond his own assassination. But he would no doubt concur. This is so because although his assessment cautiously recognizes the so-called progress made since the first Africans made landfall on the shores of the U.S., Mexico, Brazil, and elsewhere as cargo, he goes to great lengths to contextualize those steps forward in relation to the many backward steps the U.S. has taken in addressing the overwhelming inequality that characterizes its social order as a whole. Astute as ever and hopeful as always, he stands before the masses, armed with statistics, analyses, and provocations in order to paint as full a picture of the state of affairs in the U.S. as they are. And echoing Jesus's descent from Mount Olivet and weeping, the word he curates to describe this morally bankrupt, politically perilous, and socially violent set of circumstances is conditions. Humiliating conditions, tragic conditions, oppressive conditions, all of which must be vigorously condemned. These, he surmises, are the stifling conditions that submit the most vulnerable among us to an imposed silence. Our suffering, a song, a cry, to which the powerful and privileged do not listen or cannot hear, because to them our conditions, though a direct byproduct of their lives, are either unintelligible, unimportant, or too quiet. Whatever the case, the silence is by design. And it is against this silence that the people rise up and protest and riot, as he famously writes it in this speech. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And so this is where I want to introduce an aside to the original piece. I want us to suspend our position here, slow and hold our orbit around this word, conditions, spiral around its significance. Much of the work I and others do in Black studies writ large, and in the frame called Afro-pessimism, to be specific, is diagnostic in nature. And I'd like to be a good doctor, lean into my role as a singularly astute, what we might call a socio-diagnostician. To better orient ourselves, we must unpack the pathology of these manifestations of what Hartman called the afterlife of slavery. And to do so, I want to trace a circuit of thoughts between my colleagues and comrades and my own, and lay them out as what I hope is an illuminating constellation. So this is mostly off the top of my head. So Spillers, this book here. This is Hortense Spillers. This is her only book, but it's probably one of the most important texts in African American studies, in critical theory, in historical analysis, in literary theory. It's one of the most important academic texts there is. Particularly, I mean, not only because of this, but particularly because of an essay that she has called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book. And that word grammar is going to be useful for us in a second, but that word grammar is quite important. There's a quote that I have written about a number of times, and that I think is maybe the most important piece in this essay, although there are several different moments that are just as significant. But for me, in my research, this is something that has always resonated. She writes, "Even though the captive flesh or body has been liberated, and no one need pretend that even the quotation marks do not matter, dominant symbolic activity, the ruling episteme that releases the dynamics of naming and valuation, remains grounded in the originating metaphors of captivity and mutilation, so that it is as if neither time, nor history, nor historiography and its topics shows movement, as the human subject is murdered over and over again by the passions of a bloodless and anonymous archaism showing itself in endless disguise." It's a lot. But the key here are the key nodes of this circuit that she has set up for us. When she says dominant symbolic activity, and she calls it the ruling episteme, she's doing a really important thing that has had a serious impact on Black studies since, right? And she's talking about not just what we typically think of when we think of slavery, which is, policies, chains, plantations, people, owning people, right? Like, this is something that we mark as a particular era that began and ended at a certain point. Instead, she's drawing our attention to this ruling episteme. An episteme, epistemology is the study of knowledge and knowledge production. So an episteme is a system of knowledge and ideas. It is that which gives us the capacity to think anything. And so what becomes thinkable in the world is ruled by a certain set of logics and principles and ideas, right? Certain things are not able for us to be thought. Things that have not been written or conceived or are considered nonsense, right? These things are only defined that way because there's a system of knowing things that we accept as available to all of us. She's pointing us to that, right? Because what she is saying is that this system is what releases what she says are the dynamics of naming and valuation, which is to say how we come to know what a thing is, who a thing is, right? Who is valuable, who is not valuable, what constitutes a life that does matter, what constitutes a life that is expendable, right? Valuation and naming, how you classify something as something else, how you say this is a Black person, this is an American, this is not a citizen, this is a citizen. This life is expendable, this life is worth supporting and sending millions of dollars for, this life is worthy as collateral. Right? That system is what's actually in place because of enslavement. That is the real terror of enslavement. It is not merely that, as horrifying as the atrocities that you can look at photographs and read documents about are, right? The real terror of slavery is that it's a system of logic that persists as a system of logic. It's ideas, it's wispy, it's atmospheric. It's not just a thing you can break. Right? It has infiltrated everything we know as thought. That's why it's so messy, and that's why, as she says, it's as if neither time nor history shows movement. Right? Things seem to have not changed all that much. This is why in 2024, it's still completely reasonable to expect that a Black woman that called the police for help for her own house can be shot in her own home and have one of her last words be a prayer to God while holding a pot of water, right? In her own home as the person who called. Right? And that is something, unfortunately, is quite reasonable to expect to happen pretty frequently and does happen pretty frequently these days. And the reason why that continues to be a thing, right? And the reason why you have to have an entire movement that has something as simple and pretty rudimentary as Black Lives Matter. Not like Black lives are beautiful, Black lives are glorious, Black lives are the product of God. Black lives simply matter, right? The reason why you have to have even a sentence that is uttered that way, and that is such a powerful organizing principle, is because it is pushing back against the grammar, right? And what is a grammar? A set of rules and ordering logic by which language and stuff can happen, right? So a grammar is a rule system. That rule system has disallowed us from actually having a world where that is true, where Black lives do actually matter. Right? And so that's what she is pointing us toward, and that's why this is important to look at, because it shifts our thinking about enslavement. The reason why slavery can have many, many faces, right? As she says, it can show itself in endless disguise, is because it can always shift. An idea can always take a new manifestation, a new form. You can abolish slavery. What happens immediately after slavery historically? The convict lease system, which is actually a little bit worse in some ways, right? Where you are now legally imprisoned and enslaved until you can meet the contract requirements based on your imprisonment. Well, how were Black people imprisoned after slavery? Well, if you didn't have your freedom papers, or you looked suspicious, or you walked on the sidewalk while a white person was walking toward you, or you looked at a white woman as a Black man by accident, or you happened to touch something that you weren't supposed to touch, or you walked in the wrong door, or anything, right? And so then you're right back into slavery, and now it's legal, right? And if we can slightly take a tangent, there's a documentary on Netflix called 13th. Why? Because the 13th Amendment of the actual U.S. Constitution that remains today, not edited, has as its stipulation, right, slavery is abolished, except as a punishment for a crime. Right? And so, yes, technically slavery is still legal in a particular form, but it still persists in that way. Right? So even if I'm going purely based on contract and legality and constitution, it's still there. But we're talking about a system of logic and ideas that makes it so that everything is touched and poisoned by this miasma, right? This cloud of poisonous gas, right? It's like we breathe it all. This is different than what you might hear sometimes on TV or with other scholars or people talking about structural or systemic racism, right? Structure is the unique and convenient element of being. You can physically imagine a structure, and what do you do to a structure? Well, I can take down the structure. Right? But what happens when it's not a structure, but more like climate, or like atmosphere, or like the air you breathe? What then? And so that's the significance of the Hortense Spillers quote, and a lot of what I just said is stuff that other scholars have said since. Okay, this kind of occasions that we return to that quote from Saidiya Hartman, which comes from a book called "Lose Your Mother." I did not bring that. I don't have a physical copy of that book. I have her first book, Scenes of Subjection. This book is probably the most important African-American studies book written in the last 50, 60 years. And it just had a new edition published 2 years ago that I recommend people get if they want to learn more about slavery. But in that quote that I gestured toward that talks about the afterlife of slavery, the full quote says, "I wanted to engage the past, knowing that its perils and dangers still threatened, and that even now lives hung in the balance. Slavery had established a measure of man and a ranking of life and worth that has yet to be undone. If slavery persists as an issue in the political life of Black America and a Black life lived anywhere in the anti-Black world, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by what she calls a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery." And then she goes on to say, "I, too, am the afterlife of slavery." And so systematically and systemically, we are haunted by this thing, right? This wispy, hard to pin down ideological framework, this system of knowledge that changes and orders how we move and how we exist and how we do pretty much anything in the world. But it's also that we bear it in the flesh. We embody it as Black people, whether or not we identify with Blackness or not with Blackness, or we have a political alignment here or not. We are stuck in that position. We are marked, as Hortense Spillers would say, we are marked by this. Right? And when she says racial calculus and political arithmetic, she's saying the same thing as ruling episteme. Right? They're all trying to point to a system of rules and logic. They're all trying to say, look over there, not right here, not just at the atrocities, not just at the person getting shot, not just at the slavery on the plantation, not just about the films that show, the brutalization of slaves as it might have appeared, not just, someone in prison, not just someone being brutalized after a protest, but look beyond that in the way that Jesus might be looking through Jerusalem. Look at what's really the root cause of this. Because you can continuously say to vote your way out of this. Right? You can say to, with policing, right, cameras, any form of reformation, reform. You can even remove the police entirely. But if that system of ideas still persists, there will always be somebody and some other form of terror and subjugation that will emerge in its place, right, to ensure that order can continue. Now, when she says, I too am the afterlife of slavery, there's something useful about what a friend and good friend and colleague of mine, Zakiya Jackson, writes in her book, which came out, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, called Becoming Human. It's a very high philosophy, quite dense academic book. But she introduces a really useful idea, and she attaches, or she positions blackness, like the blackness of black people, what we say when we mean black, right? She tries to think about what that marker means. And part of the characteristics she attributes to that is what she calls plasticity. She says, plasticity is a mode of transmogrification whereby the fleshy being of blackness is experimented with as if it were infinitely malleable lexical and biological matter. So it's another register of Black Lives Matter, right? Such that blackness is produced as sub or superhuman or just human all at once, a form where no particular form shall hold, potentially everything and nothing at the register of ontology. It's quite dense, but what she's saying is that one of the effects of enslavement don't just happen historically, they happen ontologically. Ontology is the study of being. And so when you say something happens ontologically, it affects how people get to exist, right? In a fundamental way, in a like whether I choose to or accept it or not kind of way. Right? If you think about science, right? Physics is at its core, it's an analysis and study of different universal and physical phenomena, whether or not you can see or observe them. Right? Light moves at that speed, whether or not we can measure it or see it. Right? Black holes do what they do, whether or not you can actually see what a black hole is. The planets move and orbit because that's just what they do. That is the physics of the universe, right? And so in the same way, ontology doesn't care about identification or political party or anything like that, or historical moment. It is the state of being. And she is saying that blackness has positioned black people as having a plastic state of being. It is, whenever it is convenient, can be anything that the world needs. It's superhuman in that way. It's subhuman in that way. You are material that can be shaped or moved so long as it's convenient for whatever power that be. One example of this, right, is Michael Brown. Right? In the depositions of the police officer that killed him, he described Michael Brown, who was a 15-year-old boy, about half a foot shorter and about only 10 pounds heavier than the officer himself, and also unarmed, as a hulking beast. Right? And that's why he was a demonic hulking beast, and that's why I was afraid, and that's why I shot him. And obviously, we know the outcome of this case. That was believable enough to say, oh, that's reasonable. You are innocent. Right? You actually, which is to say, you were justified in shooting that boy. Right? But that logic, right, like that can warp a husky black boy with short basketball shorts and a t-shirt into a hulking demonic beast, right, to serve a particular purpose, which is to, on the one hand, get this guy off, right, make sure that he is not penalized, but on the other hand, is service as a justification and affirmation of the utility, right, and authority of the police. Oh, I can decide that. I can choose to say, oh yeah, well, I decided that he was clearly a monster, so I took him out. Right, good. In the same way, for example, there's a book called Brutal Imagination that I teach sometimes in the course that I usually introduce in the way that I'm giving this lecture here now. and Brutal Imagination is written by Cornelius Eady, and it was written about I think in the 90s. And the first half of it is inspired by a real life set of events where a white woman named Susan Brown took her 2 children, put them in the trunk of her car, and then drove the car off of a bridge, leaving them to drown in the river. She reported this to the police and imagined a manufactured, fictionalized a random black man that said kidnapped these 2 children, drove them into the ocean, into the river, and then she went about her business, right? And so now there's like this description of a person that is not real, but will definitely get certain people picked up and processed and identified as suspects, circulating amongst the police, and she is able to go do what she wants. Obviously, she is eventually caught, but that gesture, right, that sort of, I created this thing that will serve my purpose, and then that is deemed as believable, unsubstantiated, no evidence whatsoever, but the police think that's worthy of investigation, right? It's reasonable to accept, oh yeah, some random black man came into my house and took my 2 children, drove them off a bridge, and then disappeared. The fact that that was believable at all tells you enough about how this logic persists, what the plasticity of blackness means. Further, I mean, you can look at the various forms of victimhood, and I mean, one of the ways that my wife has even written about it is the problem of adultification, right? Specifically, adultification of black girls, right? How black girls are, whenever it is suitable for whatever form of media or legality or juridical process, are treated like women, right? And the same thing happens with black boys, but in a very different way, right? There's like less of a sexualization element to it. But the idea that these 12-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds are women, they're described in articles in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, in the LA Times, right, in the Chicago Tribune, right, like in major papers, as in journalistic publications, and journalism has the supposed idea of being objective, right, presented as truth, as fact. This is what happened, as women. Right? And you look at the picture, it's a 9-year-old girl. Right? This woman got into a fight with someone, right? Or the police slammed down the woman for not giving up her cell phone during the class time when the teacher had asked her to give it up. Right? The woman was slammed on the ground after her and her friends refused to leave the pool in Dearborn, Texas, and she was 12, right? But she was a woman. Right? Or black boys, 9, 10, 11 years old, being processed and tried as adults. This happens all the time. Right? And that kind of warping, the kind of distortion, the ability to like change, mutate, that ability is what was given by enslavement, and that ability is attached to the plasticity of blackness and to the malleability and shifting faces of enslavement. It can keep appearing over and over and over again. It is a tool now, it's a weapon now, it's a way of reading and creating the world around you. And that's why it's so hard to get rid of. That's why it's so hard to change. That's why it's so hard to feel like radical differences between then and now. Why we can have cell phones, but still kind of feel like we might be on a really big plantation sometimes. And then my own work, right? What I do and what I focus on, particularly in this book, but in general, is think about how all of this creates at least a fundamentally different relationship between black people and time and space. That means history doesn't work the same way. It hasn't moved the same way. Progress hasn't happened the same way. Time has not shifted the same way. As she writes, like, as if neither time nor history nor historiography in its topics shows movement. This is why it feels like things are quite, without the nice accoutrement, right? The technological advancements, the nice clothes, the access to different things, the ability to spend money and not be in chains, right? Despite all those things, there's something real similar about today and then. Why is that? What about that temporality, that timeliness, that relationship to how time happens? Why is that different for us? What is in the machine that makes that happen? And the same thing with space. I had a friend bring me to a protest near my house. I lived in Cerritos, California. That's where I'm from. And there's not that many. I mean, there's not a large black community of people there. It's mostly kind of like Irvine. It's mostly a white and Asian area demographically. That's just kind of how it is. And It's more affluent in that way. Like there's a lot of big houses, a lot of stuff like that. So and it's not a large set of black communities in that area. So my family and I were usually like the only people on our street, or I was often the only person in my class, or one of two people in my classes. And there was this guy, Nephi Artiguin. You can look him up. He was killed in 2015 in May because a neighbor who was suspicious of their presence had called the police and said that this person didn't look like he belonged here. He and his deaf sister-in-law, they were driving around trying to find a friend's house, but she's deaf, and they were having trouble like locating the actual place because I guess they had gotten the wrong address. So they were then, finally sitting in the car, and she was standing by the car. He's in the driver's seat. The police show up. The police demand identification, proof that he belongs there. They want the name, the phone number, the contact, and he's like not willing to provide these things because, I mean, why should he? So what happens next is the stuff of fiction. The police officer, the vehicle is like this. He's in the driver's seat. Police officer is here by the side of the car. The police officer says that Nephi Artiguin panicked and tried to run him over with the car, which prompted him to shoot several times, hitting Nephi in the heart, after which Nephi crashed into a light pole and a fire hydrant. The fire hydrant prevented people from resuscitating him because the pole's wires were in the water and it was too dangerous, and so he dies. All because someone called based on a suspicion that he did not belong here. It didn't look like he belonged here. What does that mean, to look like you belong somewhere? Visiting a friend, me going to see my cousins in LA somewhere, or a fellow colleague who happens to live in a big house somewhere because he's been working for 25 years and he's really pretty well off. Right? Henry Louis Gates Jr., one of the most famous African-American studies scholars, and we saw how that played out. I mean, he was profiled in front of his own house because he couldn't get the key to open the door. They had to have a whole sit-down with President Obama and the police officer over milkshakes or whatever nonsense, right? As if that resolved the situation or changed what I'm saying, changed the logic that allowed that to happen in the first place, where status and degrees and money and knowledge don't protect you at all. Precisely because the thing that you are claiming that they might protect you from is so widely believed, so accepted as true and reasonable and expected and as knowledge, as what is and what should be. And it takes many forms and many faces because now it's like bled out into strategies and ideas and becomes the same sort of, you see it echoing in different forms of subjugation around the world. That's why I mentioned that the many things that he might be looking at. Right? The problems in Congo, in Sudan, in Gaza, in Azerbaijan, in Pakistan, in Armenia, in Ukraine, anywhere. And places I probably don't know about, haven't heard about, and that's just war and genocide. I'm not even talking about the implications that slavery has had for ecological disaster and for climate change, because those things are tied up together. For how capitalism disenfranchises and exploits every single person in a way that is bound to how slavery did it. We haven't even talked about that. We haven't talked about how, for example, the other registers of black space and black relationships to space are that wherever blackness is usually considered at least where blackness is primarily the characteristic of the people there, it's always in some disenfranchised, impoverished, or environmentally unsafe place. I mean, if you look at Detroit and the studies that are finally being studied about Detroit, which is only happening now because of the work of decades of activists trying to push for this, all those, it's surprising, but I mean, baffling, right? I mean, it's so unbelievable that being down the street from hundreds of automotive plants could be disastrous for your health. Who knew? Right? Incidences of cancer way higher than anywhere else on the planet. Places like Ferguson, right, which is where the Black Lives Matter movement sort of took off, where Michael Brown was killed. right? Lead in the water for 50 years. And it's still like that, right? That was discovered when Michael Brown was killed. That has not been fixed. The governor who knew about it and who spent state money doing other things, shoring up his own accounts, paying higher salaries to officials that were, cool and copacetic with what he was doing, tried and thought to be found okay. Wasn't really liable for anything. That was, Stacey Abrams was going at him like for a few years, and it just kind of fizzled away. That water is still poisoned by lead. Those pipes are still old and still degrading, probably worse than they were before, which precipitates into what? Learning conditions, bad health, vulnerabilities that we don't even imagine yet. The rest of this talk would have been about sort of transferring from the diagnostic element to thinking about what happens next after Jesus arrives at the temple in Jerusalem. And what he does there, which is something he had already done once before this, at least one time before this, was he goes in, and I think we know the story. He goes in, he sees the money changers and all the things happening and the corruption of the temple, and he flips the tables and casts them out. Right? And so if you put those two things together, that we do not know the conditions for peace, his weeping, right? And then this action that follows that, right? I take that to be a lesson in how we might come to know the conditions for peace, or at least come to make them possible, which is to say, the kind of upheaval, the kind of disturbance, the kind of care that he's talking about is not just this sepia-toned, gilded, love thyself kind of care. That's important. But it's also a very active and very disturbant kind of care. It's an insurgent kind of care. It's, I'm going to go flip the tables in the places of corruption because that needs to happen. They need to be cast out. Not allowed to exist because, we got to keep the peace. No, like that, they are an affront to the idea of peace as I see it, and I'm going to go show you how to do this. This is a moment of instruction, not just something to remark about every 8 or 9 months in the first 15 minutes of a sermon, right? This is something that is actually a paradigm, a framework for how we might need to move. If we actually do, this is why it was called the insurgency of care, if we care about the lives that have been imperiled or that have been looked upon by the face of slavery in a particularly horrifying kind of way, it might need to look like what Jesus did. I don't know if there's any other example that is worth following other than Jesus' own. I don't know better than Jesus. I wouldn't claim to. And if that's what he did, maybe there's something to learn from that act. Maybe this is why King says that he says a riot, right, is the language of the unheard. When he later says in that second speech, which we're not going to get to, but he calls it a true revolution of values. And so when we're talking about the many faces of enslavement, maybe how to punch that face, right? How to remove the mask and see it for what it really is, and then to confront that visage. We might need to really, really consider more carefully King's words and then Jesus' example by way of strategy, not just as metaphor or allegory, but as action, as a thing that we can actually do to make a difference. All right. Thank you.